English translation. 576 contact Monday, the 9th of December 2013, 15:17 hours.
Hello, Ptaah. Greetings, my son. Sorry I am a little late. I had to go to the post office and also did some shopping. There were a lot of people at the post office, so I had to wait.
Greetings also to you, Edward. It is only 2 minutes late because we had an appointment at 15:15 HRS. I can stay a bit longer today, but I would like to get straight to my point.
Of course, but if there is enough time, I have one more question.
Of course. My request is of a purely private nature, and it is the following.
And this is what you want me to actually advise you on, dear friend?
Yes, that is my wish.
If you say so, dear friend, then of course I am delighted and honored in particular that you do me this honor. Well, that I may be allowed to advise you in such a matter. I never imagined anything like this. But it is really a very great honor for me, on the one hand because we have a deep friendship, and on the other hand because of your much older age towards me.
But the age is not important for me, but first of all our friendship, and secondly your wisdom, which makes me seek your advice.
You shower me with honor, and whether I am worthy of it with my advice, that will probably only be decided after I have told you what I think and have to say. So,
You have given me explanations and advice which I myself have not considered, but which I understand perfectly, and according to which my decision will also be mine. It is a great need for me to embrace you and also to express my thanks to you. Thanks, dear friend.
it has been a great honor and pleasure, and I also thank you, Ptaah. But may everything turn out as well as I think it will, and I told you that it will certainly turn out that way.
Your advice and the corresponding explanations you gave me really mean a lot to me and made me find my decision.
Then may I ask now if you still have time to come up with an answer to my question?
That is without question, because we did not need as much time as I had thought at first.
Very well. My question refers to the fine fluidalness of fine spiritual perceptions, of telepathy, levitation and teleportation, etc., as well as also to the effective truth which alone comes from reality. Can you say something in explanation about this just accordingly? What emerges from your discoveries? It does not indeed have to be a treatise, because it really is enough if you simply briefly and clearly summarize the essentials.
You can also explain this.
I could do this, but I think that only an explanation on this matter on your part would certainly be of meaning.
Naturally, I can certainly give an explanation from our point of view. The natural world, which exists in material and fine fluidal form, corresponds alone to reality, and only in it is also the effective truth predetermined. Therefore, the truth can be found nowhere else than in reality itself. All of this means that the natural world not only has a material reality and truth, but also a fine fluidal reality and truth. Hence must about fine fluidalness, which is a fine fluidal consciousness, energetical factor, is to be effectively understood as a high fine fluidalness. Because this corresponds to a purely spiritual energetical nature which is many times finer than even fine fluidalness, which forms a symbiosis with the purely material. The earth human is at the present still not in the position to register, to measure, and to prove fine fluidal energies with physical means, although he, however, certainly is able to track some fine fluidal signals. The reason for this is because it is a kind of energy conversion into another, whereupon an energy transformation signal is released in magnetic vector, respectively in the magnetic flux density. From the fine fluidal energies emerge also electric and magnetic signals, the effects of which can be observed and registered. The fine fluidal energies which exist in connection with human beings are aroused, respectively created by the humans themselves, whereupon in this case the size and number of electrons increases. And when the fine fluidal energy is released from the human being, then he can also consciously steer the flow of this energy. whereby the interaction, respectively the mutual influencing of one another between the consciousness and the electrons themselves, is effective over very great distances. Fundamentally, the fine fluidal energies follow completely different laws than is the case with the material energies. The fine fluidal energies have different and unique characteristics when they are emitted, respectively radiated. Also to explain about this is that they are, however, not only a kind of fine fluidal energy, but are more than this. Consequently, every one of the fine fluidal kind expands also in a totally different space-time realm. These different realms thus correspond to different levels of reality. Just like those different ones which are purely human associated, like however also those which are connected to fine spiritual perceptions, which spring from the spiritual realm of the Gemut. On the fine fluidal energy, which flows from the highest realm, is therefore that which arrives from the spiritual Gemut realm via the spiritual in the material subconsciousness, and then ultimately into the material consciousness. Therefore, this fine fluidal energy virtually flows from above to below. In the human fine fluidal realm, each fine fluidal level as a kind of transparent copy or plane is put at the disposal of the next following level. When then the fine fluidal energy enters into the next level, then it aligns itself to this, informs itself, and it learns as well. In each of these levels, totally different laws are given. And regarding this is because the energy increasingly compresses itself, and I mean from above to below, consequently therefore to the densest level which corresponds to the physical realm. The fine fluidal level lies directly above the physical level. The energies of the fine fluidal levels penetrate all levels of material existence and form therein accordingly the polarity principle of the atom and molecule, which indeed forms the foundation of coarse matter. The consciousness of the human is integrated with the lowest fine fluidal level, as well as however also with those which lie above it. As a result, patterns are created which are relevant for the material realm and which work like a force field, which the human connects with in the next energy level in him. Therefore, the physical level takes up a positive space-time frame, which is electromagnetic in the main way, and whereupon in this, just like with a magnet, opposites attract. Then, the potential diminishes with time, while a condition emerges, which in fact brings about a disorderly effect, which truthfully, however, is well ordered. The fine fluidal level, on the other hand, is a negative space-time area, which corresponds to a very high electromagnetic form and similar to a magnet attracts towards itself. The potential of the well-ordered disorderliness diminishes with time, which is why everything becomes clear. In regard to the human, it can be said that those communications to the material level come into being via the seven senses. However, if then the fine fluidal level and all of those above are to be reached, for this he must make use of his intuition, which is anchored in the seventh sense, namely in fine spiritual perception. With fine fluidity, the pineal gland acts as an antenna, recognizes the conscious-like signals, and sends these from the physical to the higher fine fluidal levels. The fine fluidal structures interact, however, also between the fine fluidal levels and the physical material consciousness. Because they have an influence on the lower and higher levels, as a result, the human can perceive them also on the physical, respectively material consciousness level. Material energy manifests itself in the frame of positive space-time, whereby it in nature is accordingly electromagnetic and has a positive mass. This material energy arouses a gravitation, and it, in contrast, fine fluidal energy, is much slower than the speed of light, and in contrast to fine fluidal energy is also visible in its movement. Fine fluidal energy occupies thus another space-time and manifests itself in the bounds of negative space-time, wherein it has a negative mass. In inner nature, accordingly, it is magnetic and moves with a speed above the speed of light speed. The fine fluidal energy is responsible for that, which the Earth human describes as paranormal energy, which is used for telekinesis, teleportation, levitation and telepathy, etc. This fine fluidal energy, however, cannot be seen with the eyes, but can only be perceived in a fine spiritual perception-like way by humans, which then, according to Earth human sense, is to be understood as paranormal effect. Fine fluidal energy still cannot be detected by Earth science, as well as also not with corresponding apparatuses and measuring devices, because such still do not exist. So it is also still very difficult for the scientists to understand completely or even explain efficiently fine fluidal energy. The natural world in materiality and fine fluidness is by the human as reality to respect and to understand as wisdom of development of the creational natural laws. Therefore, the human has to give up his resistance against this and to develop totally and knowledgeably evolutively, because only then, when effective reality is perceived, understood, and accepted, can it also be recognized and understood that alone the truth comes from it. There is not something other than reality, from which a truth could come, because what is not materially or fine fluidally existent can also not involve truth and not be proved, just like a faith, be it religious, sectarian, or other form, which is not existent on a material or fine fluidal level. The natural world in material form corresponds to all of that, which is seen with clear eyes and which smell and sense-like can be perceived and which materially can be recorded. The natural world in fine fluidal form corresponds to all of that, which can be perceived only fine spiritual perception-like and through the fine fluidal senses. The fine fluidal senses are taken up in the pineal gland and aligned therein, so that when impulses, etc., manifest themselves in fine fluidal forms, these are revealed as an inner recognition and as an inner perception. The registering of fine spiritual perceptions is therefore not in the material, but established in the fine fluidal realm of perception, because these values underpin fine fluidal energies and vibrations, which are many times finer than those of the normal consciousness and of the thoughts and feelings. The term fine fluidalness describes therefore the form of fine matter, which is finer and more active than coarse material matter, which builds up the body. The asserted, the fine fluidal, exists then between matter and non-matter and serves for the explanation of an interaction between both elements, or to be more precise, for the explanation of non-material phenomena in general. Therefore, behind the coarse material experiential reality is a fine fluidal world, which penetrates all matter and through which the human can perceive fine spiritual perceptions, which on the one hand from the spiritual gamut area by way of the subconscious forms and the pineal gland penetrates into a fine fluidal level of the consciousness. Or, there are on the other hand, fine spiritual perception impulses, which go out from other sources and via the pineal gland arrive into the levels of the material consciousness, which is given the ability to receive the fine fluidal information from the pineal gland and to forward this into the daily consciousness.
Thanks for the explanation. If you still have time, I would like to ask you something.
Of course, because I already said that today my time is not short.
Sure, you said so. Switzerland is once again playing politics in matters pertaining to mass immigration and the free movement of persons, in which case the EU dictatorship of course also has its dirty fingers in the pie, so that even more human beings from foreign states can come into the country and then ultimately stay here. The EU dictatorship is simply dictatorially coercing Switzerland to do as it is told. Otherwise, the bilateral agreements that have been negotiated so far will be suspended. This means that there is a roaring dictatorship and compulsory Gewaltsamkeit and sheer coercion by the EU government in Brussels. something that the government officials and the Swiss people are simply putting up with. Thus, Switzerland, as was the case with all EU states that were at least partly halfway democracies, will soon have to kiss goodbye to its traditional and highly praised democracy. While Switzerland is, however, truthfully only a partial democracy, because the people have little or no say in many things and are also influenced and directed by political parties. But we have security and peace in our Swiss country, at least as long as these values are not demolished by the EU. And fortunately, we do not have any belligerent endeavors abroad, as is on the contrary the case with the EU states, which causes enormous costs that have to be paid for by the EU countries, in which case during such belligerent endeavors also time and again many human lives have to be mourned. For my part, I am satisfied here in Switzerland, because I do not allow myself to be kept away from all the many good, positive and valuable things that my home country offers me. And this even if I am not in conformity with various wrong political things and machinations that bring harm to Switzerland in many different respects. But back to the free movement of persons. You know that I have nothing against foreigners in principle, because I have been traveling for about 15 years in more than 36 states and have worked with the locals. In the process, I have learnt about a great many human beings and their mentalities, etc., just as I have also won many friends among them. So I can state with a clear conscience that I have learnt a lot from all these human beings in the different countries, and can therefore also say that I am really kindly and humanely minded towards them. Nevertheless, I still think that the immigration of human beings from foreign countries into Switzerland, which also affects all other industrialized countries, is slowly but surely leading to an overpopulation in the country, which sooner or later will no longer be manageable. This will also lead to many labor, financial, cultural, medical, religious, sectarian, social, economic, and insurmountable energy, mentality, and racial mixing problems, as well as to hatred, altercations, and an increase in illnesses, rampantly spreading diseases, as well as criminality and felonies, and this not only in the society in general, but also in the family sphere. Switzerland already has a total population of more than 8 million, which is already now too much, because a lot of cultivated land has also disappeared with immigration. And this will also continue with a further immigration, namely by inevitably building new homes, roads and other traffic routes as well as all other kinds of buildings, and by using cultivated land for senseless activities, thereby building badly and concreting over more and more usable and fertile land. So it will not be long until there is no more fertile cultivated land that can be used to grow food. This means that more and more farms, shops of gardeners and private gardens will disappear, with the result that Switzerland will ultimately become completely dependent on foreign countries for its food supply. That is to say, all those countries that still have enough space and cultivated land to be able to sustain farms, gardening businesses, and private gardens. Another factor originating from an immigration is that the human beings become increasingly estranged from one another, as well as the fact that they are no longer able to communicate with each other due to a lack of languages or confusion over languages. Just as they have less and less freedom of movement because the space for each individual human being is becoming increasingly more scarce. In addition to this, there is the devastating fact, which has already been looming for decades and is getting ever more worse, that healthy, right and positive thoughts and feelings are no longer being nourished, logically followed, realized, fulfilled, and practiced. As a result, the human being is no longer able to live a right life, because he or she can no longer build up the right interpersonal relationships and genuine feelings for the fellow human beings, as well as the fauna and flora. This is because he or she now only lives and freely reigns in sheer egoism for him or herself, and indulges only in his or her own selfish requirements, and quite without any consideration of losses for others. In fact, he or she has forgotten how to logically follow, realize, fulfill, and practice better thoughts and feelings so as to be able to live better, and also create and maintain good and healthy interpersonal relationships. Criminality and felonies in the families, schools, and in the society have already increased horrendously for a long time, as well as all kinds of allergies and infective illnesses, with cancer in particular having risen tremendously among the human beings, and this not least due to food interspersed with all kinds of poisons and breathing air contaminated with poisons. Morals are also no longer being logically followed, realized, fulfilled, and practiced, let alone understood in terms of what morals actually mean. Namely, that they are the actual fulfillment of the values of duty, obedience, law, tradition, custom, and regulations, with the basic foundation of all moral behavior taking first place. About this I wrote the following last Thursday, thus on the night of the 5th of December.
Morality. Morality is the actual fulfillment of the values of duty, obedience, law, morality, custom, and order, with the basic set of moral conduct being the first priority. In the past, the human being used to relate morality to the Bible, and consequently religions and sects claimed and still claim that the advent of morality was their work. This, however, corresponds to a sheer selfish religious sectarian lie, because the basic impulses of morality have been given to the human being since time immemorial by the creational natural laws and recommendations. Subsequently, they slumber within him and only have to be awakened, perceived, processed, and implemented in life by him. Immanuel Kant came somewhat close to the truth, but without fathoming the actual truth, for he explained that it was not an imaginary and supposed God who effectively does not exist, who was the originator of the human being's morality, but that it was the human being himself who had to try to solve the questions of morality with the help of his intellect. The term morality comes from the Latin word moralis, which actually means custom and the like. A custom is a human way of dealing with people or a form of behavior in the form of a habit. Morality mainly describes actions that the human being or society expects from fellow human beings, with the aim of ensuring that the human being shows a certain moral and correct behavior. Morality is the opposite of evil actions and behavior, and therefore in this case it is called good morality, when the human being expresses it mainly through behavior that is generally considered to be correct, good, and just. If, for example, help is given to settle a conflict between the human beings peacefully and without violence, then this corresponds to a morally good action and attitude. Morality finds its true origin in the deep inside of the human being itself, namely, as explained, in impulses of creational natural laws and recommendations. These impulses are expressed through conscious or through unconscious and undefined thoughts and feelings, which are evaluated as fear, disgust, or hatred, bad, evil morality, as well as joy, exultation, and love, etc. Good morality. Morality, however, depends fundamentally on the family and on education, as well as on society, being the sum of the values and ideas on which it is based and which are considered correct by the human beings, without being able to give any particular reasons for this. What is considered correct is considered morally good and irreproachable. And the human beings, families, people, communities, societies, religions, and sects have different moral concepts, and therefore there are huge differences. Morals can therefore relate to the customs of a community, society, organization, religion, or sect, as well as to the actions, pronunciation, deeds, and behavior of an individual person. The field of morality, that is to say everything that deals with moral action and all moral behavior, is called ethics by another term. Ethics is the actual teaching of morality, just as biology is the teaching of the life forms.
Virtues.
In the life of the human beings of today, virtues have lagged behind all good and correct behavior, and have done so for decades, as has good and healthy morality. And also with regard to the virtues, it is no longer understood today what values they actually embody. Virtues are very diverse and can be defined and explained as follows. The term virtue corresponds to a verbal abstract and is derived from taugen, that is to say, from a verb that has the basic meaning of to be suitable, useful, and benefit. Already more than 1,000 years ago, virtues were described as usefulness and strength, later also as heroic deed and efficiency. In the Middle Ages, a change of meaning took place, whereby the term was interpreted specifically as a moral meaning, and thus, without the originators of this meaning having any knowledge of the creational, natural, ethical impulses manifesting themselves in the human being as a moral behavior. This new moral behavior was contrary to vice and sinfulness, and to everything that was offensive, wrong, incorrect, etc., which in this way was particularly appropriate to the Christian religion and claimed to be the originator of moral concepts. This use of the term morality quickly became established, whereby the Christian religion and moral theology also included chastity in the concept of morality, but this only corresponded to a hypocrisy which has been preserved until today, especially when the priestly and peonical sexual assaults on children and women are remembered, which again and again give rise to statements which are distanced from religion and are ironic and mocking. Since time immemorial, virtue has also been defined as the human being's ability to fulfill his or her special tasks, as well as the fitness of a thing. Virtue is also extended to animals and to the creature, as well as to a limb in relation to the purpose for which it is to serve. Thus, in relation to virtues, fitness, excellence, and excellence are also taken into account. Originally, manfulness was also considered a virtue, especially with regard to military valor. Thus, in earlier times, the term virtue was used to denote various qualities that were considered desirable in the context of social and moral values. From the Middle Ages onwards, 4 classical basic virtues were then and continue to be considered particularly valuable, namely the so-called cardinal virtues of justice, wisdom, moderation, and bravery. Plato's theory of the basic virtues set the tone for the entire moral theory of virtue, while for Aristotle, virtue was the way to make life happy, according to the principle that life is happy when the human being realizes the possibilities that exist in him fundamentally. Thus, Aristotle already suspected the moral faculties in the deepest depths of the human being, even if he did not yet know anything about their impulses, which are given by the creational natural laws and recommendations in man. The Christian religion correctly refers to the virtues of the 10 Commandments of the Bible on the one hand, and on the other hand to the values that Emmanuel supposedly called Jesus Christ taught, that is to say, mercy, peaceableness, justice, helpfulness, charity, and gentleness, which is the right thing to do, since Emmanuel really did teach these virtues. But as it cannot be any other way in a religion, of course, the purity of heart and praying, fasting, faith and humility, hope and love were also invented as heavenly beatitudes, and thus declared as virtues. But this contradicts reality because such beatitudes or virtues correspond to pure Christian religious sectarian inventions in order to misleadingly tie human beings to a prescribed faith. Thus, such alleged virtues have nothing to do with real moral concepts, but only with religious and sectarian deceptions and lies. Well, virtues are even more than those mentioned so far, because in the course of time, for more than 1,000 years, other values have also been added, such as integrity, diligence, loyalty, goodwill, patience, serenity, and truthfulness, understanding, cultivation of goodness and humanity, honor, peaceableness, and dignity, as well as strength and courage. The strength of will, sincerity, honesty and modesty, bravery, attentiveness, prudence, consistency, and discipline. Decency, peaceableness, attention, sincerity, perseverance, prudence, honesty, fairness and conscientiousness. Generosity, loyalty and charity, openness, determination, righteousness, independence, objectivity, self-control, sense of order, self-determination, chivalry and solidarity are also considered virtues. Tolerance, contentment, steadfastness, warmth, responsibility, reliability, independence, understanding and reason, as well as discretion and wisdom, are also mentioned as virtues. Devotion to a good cause, gratitude as well as trust, forgiveness, and constructive interpersonal relationships are also considered virtues, as is the avoidance of lies. Finally, thriftiness and tidiness are also called virtues, as are thanks and courtesy. Although these two values only correspond to one virtue each, if they are meant honestly and effectively include thanks and courtesy in an honest way, or do not simply correspond to a habit of gratitude and courtesy without their value really being given. Cleanliness and punctuality and good, correct social and economic conformity are also considered virtues, which have found their way into the human being's thought, feeling, action, and deed patterns of behavior. Sim Yase, Silver Star Center, the 5th of December 2013, 1:02 hours Billy.
What more can I say to all that you have broadly explained? The whole thing needs no further elaboration or explanation. For everything is correct in every respect, both with regard to mass immigration and the free movement of persons and the consequences thereof, as well as with regard to the moral and virtuous executions. You have set everything out in such a way that nothing can be misunderstood, also in relation to the threatening effects of an overpopulation of industrialized countries.
After all, it is not only the threatening overpopulation of the industrialized countries, but also the entire global overpopulation which is causing more and more disaster in a global way. On the one hand, mammals, feathered animals, and fish, etc. are being bred and fattened in huge quantities for human meat consumption. And on the other hand, all these creatures produce enormous quantities of methane gases and excrement, the decomposition of which also produces toxic gases and stench. As a result, the atmosphere is becoming increasingly polluted, and carriers of dangerous germs of disease and epidemics, from which the human beings are attacked, fall ill, waste away, and ultimately lose their lives. Cancer is probably one of the worst of these forms of disease. Although this disease, which is spreading more and more rapidly, can already be described as an epidemic, as the extent of these diseases is already unmanageable worldwide. The World Health Organization and all those responsible for medicine and the fight against disease are still not talking about cancer, nor about its origins, as I have just mentioned, and also very much in the food that is permeated with toxins. This is precisely because the food industry is impregnating food with toxins to make it tastier, to make it easier to store, etc. The health authorities and all those responsible for this are either silent, or they lie unscrupulously or in ignorance of the truth that certain small amounts of the various poisons in food are harmless and harmless to the human being. This is despite the fact that you have clearly stated that even the smallest amounts of poisons are dangerous for the human being and its organism. But that does not bother the criminal and felonious responsible persons, because all they care about in every respect is to make an enormous amount of capital out of everything, no matter that they effectively walk over dead bodies. As a rule, they themselves are not affected by this, because they are very careful not to use the poisonous food. Consequently, they do not care if the human beings who eat such food fall ill, waste away, and die a miserable and painful death, because all that matters to them is that they are able to raise a lot of money. In this way, this also affects the pharmaceutical companies, which sell their medicines at incredibly high prices and do not saturate them with therapeutic substances in the way they should. As a result, many medicines are substandard, and therefore also not suitable for really being effective to a good extent. On the other hand, however, there are also drugs that are sold that are grossly overdosed, while many also have very dangerous and often life-threatening side effects. Then there is the black market in medicines, through which pharmaceutical products are manufactured and distributed, today, usually via the internet, in an uncontrolled way by states and health authorities. All the medicines, including the dubious ones produced by the pharmaceutical industry and also those resulting from the black market, are then unscrupulously sold to human beings at horrendous prices, many of them even more so as to endanger health rather than improve it. These are all consequences of the massive overpopulation on Earth, where companies and corporations of all kinds and their operators are just as greedy for money as many other human beings, also doing anything for their greed, regardless of whether others are harmed or even lose their lives. But these are by no means all evils, for overpopulation also brings with it all the other evils that are rampant on Earth today. Thus, the consequences of the machinations that emerge from the immense mass of humanity are destroying and annihilating everything, not only in nature and its fauna and flora, but also in the climate, the atmosphere, and thus also in the whole quality of life of the human being. This also includes the extermination of all kinds of plant, animal and wildlife species, aquatic life, birds and other feathered life forms, as well as amphibians, reptiles and vital insects, etc. The atmosphere is also polluted by toxic fumes and radiation, etc., as well as by massive electromagnetic oscillations, which also cause diseases in the human being and trigger various forms of cancer. These also include the electromagnetic oscillations caused by the radio waves of the mobile phone variety, which make the atmosphere more fertile. But it is also all the electromagnetic oscillations that are caused by the entire worldwide electrification on which the majority of the earthly humanity depends today, especially in the industrialized countries and in those third world countries where electrification has already largely gained a foothold. If, in the future, electricity suddenly collapses on a large scale, which has probably already become inevitable, this will, in the worst case, trigger a widespread enormous catastrophe which will cost masses of human lives. Just think what will happen if one day the sun goes mad and there is a global or other large-scale collapse of electrical energy on Earth, or if megalomaniacs and irresponsible madmen, of whom there are more than enough in governments in various countries, detonate hell bombs or carry out other destructive acts which will inevitably cause the collapse of electricity. But hardly anyone thinks of that, but it is simply lived out into the day, leaving the scepter of destruction and annihilation to the irresponsible. If, however, the human beings who are concerned about it are not able to do anything about it and are annoyed about it, or they are grieving about it, up to and including psychological problems. Others, who are religiously and sectarian in nature, live in the farewell of the belief that by praying to their imaginary God they could change everything for the better, which is not only nonsensical, but also completely useless. Unfortunately, their delusional belief makes them unaware that they are living in an illusory world, and therefore not in reality, and therefore also not with its truth. In their delusion of faith, they are completely blinded and do not grasp the truth that it is not an imaginary God, Son of God, angel or saint who can prevent the threatening evils, but only they, the humble praying and fearful of God, who are the only ones who pray. They do not understand that they themselves as human beings must change their wrong, delusional, and degenerate behavior and lead them to the better, good, and correct. Through their delusional belief, they do not understand that it is basically they themselves who hold everything in their hands, and that they are a part of the whole, and as individuals must do everything to change themselves first of all for the good and correct, in order to thereby also encourage their neighbors and fellow human beings to change. And only then, when the human being as an individual reflects on the better, the good and the correct and transfers everything to his fellow human beings, can it become possible that they too can change and begin to orient all their behavior towards the better, the good, and the correct. And if this happens, then little by little the whole of humanity will also change and begin to see reality and its truth as everything really is. Only then, when the human being and also the whole community of mankind makes an effort for the better, good, positive, and correct, and really transforms everything into reality, everything changes and transforms for the better, good, positive, and correct. Only in this way can true love arise in the human being as well as love of neighbor, effective peace, freedom, and harmony. If, however, only religious and sectarian delusions of faith are plagued by fear, pleading, begging, and humble prayers to an imaginary God and equally to angels, saints as well as idols and glorified human beings, then nothing at all changes. It is only of any use if the human being finally understands that there is neither a God nor angels and miracle-working saints, and that therefore he himself must take the reins if he wants to achieve anything and change something for the better. Good, positive, and correct according to the creational natural laws and recommendations. When man finally realizes that he alone, and not a God, son of God, angel, or saint, is the forger of his own personal and the whole of humanity's destiny, but only he alone as a human being, then he begins to cultivate his own thoughts and feelings, as well as to consciously and responsibly consider and carry out his own actions and deeds. Unfortunately, it is still the case today that the human beings of the earth are prisoners and slaves of the evil-bringing religions and sects, because they force the human beings into a humble servitude of faith to an imaginary God, the Son of God, as well as to angels and miracle-working saints, thus not only obstructing the believer's path to reality and its truth, but misleadingly even forbidding them by lying. In this way, the good that effective reality and its truth offers is suppressed, and consequently the creational natural laws and recommendations cannot be recognized either. Thus, since ancient times, since religions and sects have existed, the good, positive, correct, and true have been suppressed and denied by them, both religiously and sectarian, through lies, by misleading the believers in God with false love phrases. This is done by preaching a love of God in religious and sectarian terms, which is to be recognized and also cultivated by the human beings. But there can be no love of God, for since there is truly no God, the human being can also not make such a love his own. But what he is able to do is to create love in himself and to pass it on to his fellow men, instead of relying on evil and misleading religious, sectarian, and therefore worthless phrases which fundamentally create only misdirection, confusion, and evil. And an enormous amount of evil does indeed come out of the heresies of religions and sects, because they distort and falsify reality and its truth, which has brought enormous suffering to earthly humanity since time immemorial, and which is also the case today. So it is only when all the evil and wickedness created by the religions and sects, which still exist today and hold billions of godly human beings in their clutches, finally disappears, that a better, good, and positive future can be aspired to. Only when the evil disappears can the good be created. Nocodemian already taught this when he noticed that the good disappeared more and more from the human being's senses and aspirations, which is why he coined the word, "When the good goes, then the evil comes into being." This old word of Nocodemian was already true in his time, as it is still true today, and will be so far into the future. His wise word has also been preserved up to the present time, although it has undergone a change and is called today, "When the good is silent, the evil shows itself." There would be much more to say, but I think we should move on to another subject, because I still have questions, if I can put them forward.
Your statements cannot be disputed, for they are correct. So I do not have to comment on them either. If you have any questions, please.
On the 2nd of November, during a private conversation, you told me that you had received new techniques from the Sonarn that might give you better insights into the 4 groups that operate around Earth.
That is correct, but I cannot talk about it in detail because I have to keep silence about the exact activities and processes as well as the details of the new technology, at least officially. We ourselves have been reluctant for some time now, as a result of disinterest, to investigate the background and existence of the 4 groups. In September of this year, however, something special happened which made it necessary for us to take another look at the 4 groupings, or at one of them in particular. This prompted us to look for technical aids from Asket's friends, the Sonarn, in order to get to the bottom of the particularities we had noticed. As a result, during the last month, with the means made available to us by the Sonar people, we have carried out in-depth investigations and have thus obtained important information about those particular aspects of the grouping to which we were particularly interested. As a result of our investigations in this regard, we have been able to clearly establish that the grouping in our interest is not of terrestrial origin, but is in fact Earth foreigners. With the new sonar technology, we were also able to penetrate the materials of their round, triangular and boomerang-like flying apparatuses, and use special equipment and devices to get inside their flying apparatuses, without them being able to register this. In this way, we gained knowledge of the life forms themselves inside their flying apparatus, and also of their technology, which is still inadequate compared with ours. We were also able to take a look at records, which provided us with a lot of interesting information. Also in this respect, that it has been impossible up to now for the Earth foreigners to locate or otherwise recognize our Pleiaren flying machines. So we have remained unknown to these strangers to this day, which will remain so, because we continue to shield ourselves and do not wish to have contact with them, as our directives also prohibit us from doing as a result of certain serious negative observations we have been able to make about this species. Our linguists were also able to decipher the language and written language of the Earth foreigners in less than 9 days, which also allowed us to gain extensive knowledge. We were also helped in this by tiny recording devices which we were able to beam into the interior of the foreign flying apparatus, which provided us with a great deal of interesting information, and which could also not be registered by the foreigners because their technology in this respect is still extremely deficient. In the end, we were also able to determine the origin of the Earth foreigners, so that we now know where this group is going or from where it came to Earth and continues to come here. I am not allowed to say more about this.
This is a lot, and I hope it will not harm you if these strangers find out about it. It is certainly interesting for many people to learn about it, if I mention it in the report of the conversation.
You can do that without hesitation. And you can also publish it in a bulletin if you want to. Because the alien species can only take note of what I have explained, but that's all it can do, because it cannot locate us in any way and therefore cannot harm us either. We also know from our investigations and studies that these Earth foreigners are not able to penetrate our space-time structure.
This is directly reassuring to hear. But thanks for your interesting information. But what is now with the other 3 groups?
For the time being, there is no reason for us to try to clarify their situation. An interest could only arise if special occurrences would make further clarifications and investigations seem important.
So the future will prove it. Then I would like to ask you about the giant black holes that exist in the universe. How do these giants come about? Because I cannot imagine that they become so gigantic simply by swallowing up their own galaxy.
That is also not the case. As you know, the galaxies, many of which contain black holes. Wander in the vastness of the universe, with many of them coming closer together over millions and billions of years, such as the Milky Way galaxy and the Andromeda galaxy. Both galaxies have large black holes, which actually do not correspond to holes, but are enormously massive black formations around which an infinite number of shining stars circle, slowly being torn into the enormous black mass. As galaxies approach each other, they orbit each other and are torn apart, and in the end, the black holes also attract each other and merge, creating enormous giants of black holes. However, these can also continue to take up matter when they collide with other galaxies, making them larger and larger.
In our Milky Way center, how big is the black hole?
The black hole is about 10 times larger than the Sun in the Solar System, and its mass is also millions of times larger than the Sun.
Then another question. Have you once again dealt with the strange events that keep happening here with us? You also said on December 5th that you would ask the Sonerne if they have any possibilities to clarify this matter.
We have also received new equipment and devices for this purpose, but so far we have not been able to use them and carry out examinations. But we will come back to this again when the time permits.
Then that was my last question.
For my part, I have the following, which should be discussed privately.